Ladies and gentlemen, today we feel very honorable to have another keynote speaker, Mr. Sanjana Yajitha Hattotuwa, who has considerable expertise in media and conflict. Mr. Hattotuwa is a head of the Media Unit Center for Policy Alternative in Colombo, Sri Lanka. He is also an editor at Ground Views and has been a special advisor at the ICT for Peace Foundation, Geneva, Switzerland, since 2006. And he is also a lecturer at University of Lugano, Switzerland, since 2010.
Mr. Hattotuwa's publications and articles include Freedom of Information, A Case for Peace, Openness, and Good Governance, The Role of Conflict, Sensitive Journalism, The Role of Media in Peace Processes, and Peace Process in Sri Lanka. Ladies and gentlemen, we are also most fortunate this morning to be able to hear Mr. Sanjana speak to us on Sila between Sila and Charybdis, harnessing the potential of new media for conflict transformation. Please welcome Mr. Sanjana Yajitha Hattotuwa.
I actually am going to do the old-fashioned thing and just speak without any presentation at all. Partly because on the night of my departure to Thailand yesterday, my Mac crashed completely. And for the first time in as many years as I've traveled abroad, I'm traveling without a computer. So I thought it was a good opportunity to also do the old-fashioned thing and pen down some of my thoughts on paper and ask you to also join me in a journey of imagination, because I want to use this opportunity and the luxury of being away from Sri Lanka. When you're in it and when you're in the country, I hardly ever have time to think more broadly upon the things that I do, to have that luxury to take you also on this journey to imagine what is possible with technology and peace building. I thank the organizers for the invitation. It is not often that one gets to get out of the country and think more broadly about what one does day in and day out. I've often come to Bangkok, and if anybody asks me my first impressions of Patani, I would use the English word verdant. Verdant refers to the green, the lush green that one sees outside, which reminds me so much of the more rural parts of Sri Lanka. But I think all conflict has innately, intrinsically, a verdant potential for its transformation. No conflict that I have lived through all my life and I have seen is without and is bereft of those opportunities for transformation. And my submission, my life, my work in my adult years have been to enhance, to augment, to strengthen that which is intrinsic in the worst of conflict, to bring out the best of us. The title was sent to the organizers many moons ago, many months ago. And Sila and Charybdis is not from our own culture. It's from my own background of learning English literature as a student of English literature in Delhi. And it comes from Greek myth, and it speaks of twin dangers, two dangers, Sila and Charybdis. It was a mythical passage through which sailors went through. And if they went close to one part of that passage, obviously they were shipwrecked. And if they went close to the other part, they were shipwrecked as well. So I used it as a metaphor. And Sila and Charybdis, for me, are ignorance and misuse of what we call, and probably many of us use, as technology, information communications technology, in the work that we do as peace builders in a violent conflict zone. First, some background to give you an idea of where I'm coming from to help you understand. In 2002, I was fresh out of university, a couple of years after university, and was asked to help with the technical design of what at the time led to a ceasefire agreement. Sri Lanka has witnessed 27 years of brutal conflict that ended, the war ended in May 2009, so this was a very long time before the war ended. That's a different story, but I got involved in peace process design and conflict transformation, not as a student of it. I was a student of English literature, but because I was asked to get into the process, and I read up about it, and with my interest in technology, I helped design a process through which actors involved in the ceasefire monitoring were able to talk with each other. In 2006, I set up what has become, in the 8 years since, one of Sri Lanka's leading online platforms for discussion and debate, called Ground Views, which some of you may have remotely heard of. In 2008, I set up the Sinhala version, the vernacular version of it called Vikalpa. And earlier this year, I set up the second language version, which in Sri Lanka you speak Sinhala, Tamil, and English. English is the least spoken language. So it was important to have the vernacular as well, and it was called Matram. So now we have 3 independent citizen journalism sites in the country that publish, promote, and produce content and discussions that mainstream media cannot and will not. As a consequence of why I set up Ground Views, it was to be a safe space for hard discussions. As you know, in conflict, there are emotive discussions that people get very worked up about. And when that happens, we get very emotional about the topics we feel passionate about. I set up Ground Views so that it would become a safe space for the discussion of emotive issues. You could agree to disagree, but do it respectfully. So nothing goes up on the site, nothing, not a word goes up on the site without me looking at it, without me moderating it, without me curating it. For 1.5 years, I had a co-editor, but for over 8 years, I've done it single-handedly. The result of that is that I've, on Twitter alone, since 2008, published around 4.6 million words in total. I've read about 7.5 million words, over 50,000 comments, on an average of 150 words per comment. And I've read close to 6 million words, over 3,000 articles, in articles alone, excluding the photography and video, over 8 years. So it's been both exhausting, but I now almost have what can be called a machine response. I see an article, I see a debate, I see a comment, and I'm able to locate it within the larger matrix that is Sri Lanka's ongoing conflict. And this gives me some unique perspectives. In 2004, I did a master's, trying to look at the nexus between technology and peace building. At the time, there was nobody to supervise me. So I had to get a supervisor from the School of Computing, even though I was located in the School of Political Science. And today, over 12 years after, I'm very heartened to see this kind of conference looking at seriously the nexus of technology and peace building. I take a look at, though, the program, and this is no reflection at all about the organizers, and I see something, however, very interesting. Just after these keynote sessions, we divide into 2 large groups. One group is going to look at political conflict, social movements, and peace. The other group is going to look at peace journalism, media, and peace. And I find that very interesting, that bifurcation, because that's precisely, I think, where we need to focus our energies on. Because for me, that is a false dichotomy. When we talk about media, and tomorrow Jake will talk about peace journalism and peace building, we continue to interrogate, explore, research, study, and question these 3 domains as contradistinct to each other. And there is no real meeting point in the same room, in the same discussions, and on the same panels over what I see are inextricably entwined processes if you're talking about conflict transformation. We still continue to talk about these aspects as 3 different things, and I think that needs to change. And that confluence, in a sense, is where I live and work in, and I try to set an example and a template for others to emulate. For me, as a non-academic, peace building and conflict transformation is a lived process. It's something that comes from within. It's something that is a reaction to that which I have experienced. Growing up in a country where at one point there was per capita the highest number of suicide bombings in the world, plus a Marxist insurgency in the late 80s. For me, if I were to divide it, and perhaps artificially, the peace building and conflict transformation is both conceptual, it's also something of a physical process. Conceptually, it's for me the articulation, the definitions, the redefinitions, the contestation, the markers, the archiving, the erasing, the inclusion, the exclusion, the ideation, the censoring, the promotion, all of that which happens in the domain of concepts and ideas within ourselves, within our communities, between our communities and our peoples, within a country, between nations, regionally and internationally. It's also physical because it's also logistical. We bring people together around certain protest rallies and movements. We want to be seen together, to rally around a particular idea or a cause or a mantra. So there are protests, there are territories that we need to protect or need to combine, there are geographies that we need to organize around. So it's also something very physical. And both, for me today, are inextricably embedded and entwined in technology, what we call information and communications technology. There's nothing Einsteinian, there's nothing genius about this, there's nothing particularly revolutionary about it. We have all been students of this. We all probably use media in the way that we do, but we haven't possibly thought about this as seriously as we should. And for me, that brings up another divide of this long-standing, enduring divide of, on the one hand, the academics who study this seriously and those who do, the practitioners. And if I may take the luxury of this podium to suggest a new word to the English lexicon of something that I coined up on the flight here called pracademics, practical academics, or those who practice and also academically question that which they do. Those unique people who are able to critically look at what they do seriously, but not stop them in that process of questioning from doing what is needed and necessary and sometimes very timely. So in a sense, what's changed? In a sense, as an Asian, as a South Asian, as a Sri Lankan coming to Thailand, this is stating the obvious. We are leaders in how technology can shape digital discourses, but also national, regional, communal discourses, sometimes very inconvenient truths as well. We have, all of us, never seen before the kind of world that we are living in today, and we take it for granted, and that's the beauty of it. We have never seen so much of people producing so much of information in human history since Homo sapiens evolved from Homo erectus. We have never seen an era, an epoch, a time when all of us, whoever we are, wherever we are, whatever we do, whatever our identity is, with an ability to create information for certain audiences. And what is interesting me for that, around that is that very often we treat or see or perceive those in conflict as victims. And that to me is true and continues to be true, but what we don't see often is seeing them as agents of change as well. They might be simultaneously victims of a larger conflict, but they are today agents of their own narrative. They can write their own narrative and write their own future. And that to me is a fundamental change that we need to embrace and take cognizance of more seriously. The second thing as a consequence is something that I told UNESCO on a podcast a couple of months ago when I was asked, what is this term I often use called bearing witness? And I quote, with the ability of technology today, that bearing witness is an active process because it takes courage to do it. It is not a passive act. It is observing. It is an act you choose to do. You act to a body of knowledge, and in the future, that body of knowledge can be very useful in helping understand why something happened around that time. In other words, close quote, we can record that which is important to us and which we think is going to be important for those in the future, without any mediation or permission from anybody else. And I think that's genuinely something damn new, that we can do it with what we have very often in the palm of our hand. So we don't need to go to a shop and buy some of these high-end camera equipment recording me at the moment. We can do that process of bearing witness with what we have in the palm of our hands, which pegs into something that a Nigerian novelist called Chimamanda Achebe said about the single story, the single narrative. And I quote her, "The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story. They become only one story." In Sri Lanka, for example, the story today, after May 2009, is a country at peace after the end of the war, where we are enjoying unbridled, unprecedented development, and we are looking forward to the future with great hope and optimism. Now, you need to only scratch a little bit under that meta-narrative, that glorious narrative, to find that conflict is still very deep and persists in the country. And that's, I think, what technology affords us to do, to create many narratives to contest a single narrative that otherwise can shape history in the years to come. I also see peace and conflict transformation as something that changes the more you study it. And that's why I'm encouraging and submitting, using the luxury of this podium, that we possibly need to study the art, the form, the ways of conflict transformation. Whoever we are, we need not be students in this university, we need not be part of the faculty, you need not be me, you need not be a professor who's giving a keynote. Whoever we are, whether a mother, a father, a lover, a student, a neighbor, we have the power and the potential to shape the conflict that surrounds us. And I think to study that is important at whatever level. And with regarding that, I think there are three key challenges as I see it: technical, political, and perceptional. On the technical level, some of us use these devices, but we don't understand how technically sophisticated and advanced they are. So you have, for example, if you were to study this seriously, the enduring problem of how to make sense of what is being produced. Lots of people come up to me and say, Sanjana, but there's such a tsunami of information. How on earth are we supposed to sift from that noise what is actionable intelligence, what is important perhaps for decisions around conflict transformation, interventions into communities? And that is not an insignificant problem. It is not an insoluble problem, but is not an insignificant challenge. You can address it, but it does require investments in institutions, in individuals, perhaps in research, but most certainly in the kinds of processes that embrace those technical considerations. There's also a political problem. Nehru, on the dawn of India's independence, spoke of India's tryst with destiny. Famous words, wonderful speech. And I think we today, wherever we are in the world, are also engaged in another new kind of discussion with our governments, with a new tryst for our collective future. There are some governments, some in power, who may not be in government, who seem to believe that a censorious, a controlled future that is harmonious because of the sameness it encourages is the best possible future for us. There are others who disagree that containing, controlling, and censoring is not the way forward. Sometimes these debates are highly emotive and violent, and other times they are mediated through more saner channels of communication and moderation. But this is a new, genuinely new social conversation occurring across a range of media platforms and using a range of voices. And I think that that political angle and dimension to information is also very important because it has genuinely created new conversations around deep politics. There's also a perceptional problem. Lots of people come up to me and say, Sanjana, but you're talking esoteria. You're talking about a luxury that is only enjoyed by the people who can, for example, afford a smartphone. And while I take that on board, I think that some of the myths and misperceptions around technology are also worth considering. For example, lots of people think of new media and technology as the internet on broadband, just smartphones, just the web, just content in English, just accessible by largely an urban elite, requires, for example, literacy to produce, does not impact a national discourse, is essentially and indubitably ephemeral. It lasts only a short time and is then forgotten, is deeply subjective and therefore unable to extrapolate a larger communal or national sentiment, and is, as a consequence, deeply flawed. Now, these are some of the pushback that you get when you talk about technology and peace building. But I think that it ignores so many other dimensions of what I call a rich spectrum of technology's embedded nature in peace building and conflict transformation. In the conversations that are engineered, that are founded upon, and developed and produced by that which we do as a daily habit, the SMSs we send, the Facebook updates we put up, the YouTube videos we put up. These are all social conversations, and I think you can't distill them into simplistic categories. And I call for a fuller understanding, also simply because as Asians in particular, we must take some pride in demonstrating to the rest of the world the sheer diversity of technological foundations, apps, and services that we use to communicate with each other. For example, in the Philippines, I think it's largely taken to be the text capital of the world. You know, I think there are billions of text messages being sent around. In your own country, and I'll come back to that later, technology is integral to certain forms of resistance around the political rule that you have to endure today. So I think that, in a sense, it behoves us, because the deep irony is that communities who use the technology are way ahead of the study in how those technologies are used. And I think we need to catch up. Why, you might ask, is this important? Why? Pourquoi? Why do we need to give a damn? On the one hand, there is the obvious. So these are statistics that you can get off Google. There are 50 million tweets a day. 50 million. There are 700 million minutes spent on Facebook alone in a month. There are 1.3 exabytes, and this is a new term even for me. We've had to develop new terms to measure the quantum of information. An exabyte, I think, is 1 million terabytes. Of 1.3 exabytes of data sent and received by mobile smartphone users in a day globally. So, I mean, these are mind-boggling numbers, perhaps even senseless and difficult to even grasp if you are not data scientists. But what I think is that it needs and requires us to shift our perceptions around what do we do as peace builders around this. And for me, there are 3 key things around this. There's the volume, there's velocity, and there's variety. And this is what you generally call big data. And this is not something that peace-building theorists and academics often talk about. For me, what's interesting is the volume. How much is being said around a particular region, topic, issue, stakeholder, community, or process? How much is being said? In what language, for example? In terms of velocity, how much is being produced at any one point of time? For example, what we have often seen is that when there's a higher incidence of violence or a violent incident, the language and social media discussion becomes simplistic, resorts to myth, becomes monocausal, and is attributing that violence to a single actor or community. So the richness and the complexity of that conflict or complex political emergency is often lost in social media production in response to a violent incident, but over a period of time, social media can also provide great insight. So it's very interesting to study the velocity. Which also brings up the question of variety. What are the diverse opinions? Who is producing this? What are they saying? For example, is content in English by the same actor or community different to the context that they would, the language that they would use when speaking to their own community? And sometimes there's a remarkable difference. For example, in Sri Lanka, the president and the government would say sometimes diametrically opposed things when the same speech is translated into English, because they have different constituencies to address. And I think that this is very rich for harvesting. I have tried to do this and set an example. And I say these not with egotism, but as a template for study more broadly. In 2011, I set up a web exhibition of short-form video and photography called Moving Images. And through moving images, I wanted to interrogate a process that at the time just started, which is called the beautification of Colombo. The beautification of Colombo suggests that, obviously, prima facie, that Colombo is going to be made into a beautiful city, but what that does not entail or look into is the displacement of communities, low-income communities, low-income housing, who are basically being bulldozed away and shipped off elsewhere so that you don't even see them. So the narrative around beautification refers to these communities as 2 things: slums and shanties. Slums and shanties, and what the process that I did was try to highlight was these communities are also very rich. They are Muslim, they are Sinhala Buddhist, they are Tamil Hindu. They are some of the most ethnically, religiously, and culturally diverse communities in the city who are now being uprooted and their rich cultural ties deracinated. So that was a way in which photography, digital photography, and short-form video was interrogating it. In 2012, I was invited by an art gallerist to do an art exhibition. Now, I am not an artist. I've never done something like this in my life, but I took it as a challenge because I think peace building and conflict transformation needs to also think of different ways in which we interrogate conflict. So with my interest in digital media, I got together a constitutional theorist, Norbert, this was Azanga, with an artist to draw in a triptych, 3 drawings, Sri Lanka's constitutional power evolution over 3 decades. So we were interrogating through art what was a process of constitutional reform or lack thereof over 3 decades. I got a social pollster to work with a disc jockey, a DJ, a very good DJ, who's also a graphical artist, to look into the divide between the Sinhala and Tamil communities. I got a leading economist to work with a graphics designer. And I got an award-winning novelist to work with one of Sri Lanka's most renowned artists. Now, if I tell you the topics that were discussed, federalism, unitary, united, Buddhism, Islamophobia, Muslim identity, Sinhala Buddhist identity, gender, unemployment, youth aspirations, the Sinhala-Tamil divide, conflict, and majoritarianism, these would sometimes, for the academics, be very interesting, but for the vast majority of the population, be utterly boring. However, through the exhibition, we made it interesting. And there was an unprecedented number of people from Colombo who are generally very apathetic to the country's future, who nevertheless came and engaged on these issues. And the point is that there are ways in which technology can enhance debate around even an apathetic context. And last year, I did something called 30 years ago, which was a digital, web-based look at the defining moment of certainly my life and a generation of Sri Lankans, which was in July 1983, where I went home from school as a 7-year-old child looking at Tamils being burnt alive, and that was called Black July. It was an anti-Tamil program, and that, in a sense, defined the 30 years that we have inhabited the country since. And on the occasion of those 30 years, I wanted to use technology to interrogate what the country was and had become, not just after Black July, but after the end of the war. And it was widely recognized as an unprecedented look into, because it also involved the diaspora, a very hard, emotive, divisive period in our country, and what remains to be an issue today. So I want to extrapolate from that personal what can be things that you guys can do, both in your country, but wherever you come from, and whatever institutions you belong to. And there are 2 things, observing and harvesting, both which require attention to what I have been talking about, simply because it is, for me, as I said, integral to peace building and conflict transformation. One is the obvious. We are, all of us, on the web, on the internet, and on mobile phones. All of us, wherever we are. I would not believe that there is a single person in this room who doesn't have an email account, who doesn't possibly have a smartphone, who doesn't see YouTube on a daily basis, and who is not in some way connected to the internet and the web. In fact, it is so prevalent, it is so pervasive that, again, we've never had something like this in human history before. And it's even, for me, hard to imagine a life before the internet. I grew up, I did my bachelor's degree in an India that didn't have an internet. In 1997, India didn't have the web. So I can remember a time that the internet wasn't integral to what I do and my life, even personally. But it's difficult to imagine it, even if we recall it, because we are now so hooked on to the technology. And as a consequence, we tend not to think of the technology when we get news around violence. Just think about it. The images around Gaza today, the images around Ukraine, the images around Erdogan's response to the Gezi Park uprising in Turkey, Tahrir, since the time of the so-called Arab Spring. Ferguson in America today, police brutality at its worst in the heart of America. All of these stories come through us, even though we don't recognize it, through enhanced technology. I can see, for example, greater narratives in Sri Lanka today through technology than there were just 5 years ago at the height of the conflict when we were heading into the end of the war. So technology, those are some of the more obvious ways in which we engage with technology. But my submission is a bit more nuanced than that. I think we understand the content that we get from these sources, but I want to encourage practitioners and academics to think of the systemic nature. New media as an ecosystem that undergirds, fuels, and is inextricably entwined with conflict transformation. So new media not just as an output of videos, but as a system that we can analyze and study. There was, for example, a very interesting article that I read in the New York Times coming to Patani that was published yesterday. That is an absolutely fascinating look into inequality in the US. The New York Times has done a fascinating study about the counties that are the happiest and the richest, and the counties in America that are the poorest and the unhappiest. And there's an interesting insight when you correlate that with the kinds of things that these communities and counties are searching on Google. So for example, the counties that are the easiest to live in and the richest in the US search for a Canon ELPH camera, search for holidays in Switzerland, and search for things that I think is a luxury product for babies. So they're interested in families, they're interested in holidays abroad, and they're interested in digital cameras to record themselves, high-end ones. The hardest and the poorest counties are interested or searching for on Google health problems, obesity being one of them, guns, video games, and religion. And in religion, they are focusing on the Antichrist. So it's an absolutely fascinating insight. My question is, can we do the reverse? Can we look at the quantity and quantum and content and qualitative content that is on the web, and as a consequence, get insights into conflict and communities on the ground, just by the content that they produce, just by, for example, looking at Google. I call this digital smoke signals. Can we get an inkling into something that's going wrong or going good just by looking at the quantum of information online and on the web? For example, if something were to happen in the US or anywhere else along the lines of Ferguson, can we say that just by looking at the content that is being produced by those citizens, that we can get to know what to do and what not to do if we are engaged in conflict transformation? So another aspect is something called, not so obvious, is something called call data records, CDRs. Again, not even remotely on the vocabulary of most journalists and certainly academics involved in peace building and practitioners even. What's a call data record? A call data record is something that every single one of us who has a mobile phone, need not be a smartphone, makes in our telcos every single time we make or get a call. It's the call time, the number that you gave the call to or got the call from, the call duration, and the location in which you were when the call was made or received. It's a basic thing that billions and billions and billions of records telcos have. What's interesting is that using those records, there are some interesting things being done now. In Indonesia, for example, there's an interesting correlation between the number of texts sent with certain words and food insecurity. Far, far quicker than the government can get it otherwise. So you can look at, for example, the call data records and ascertain movements of people, population flows, purchasing history, and based on the call length, the economics of a community. If you are better off, you can you tend to get top-ups more frequently for your mobile phone. If you are worse off, you tend to get top-ups less frequently. So there's some interesting, I think, correlations by looking at what's called big data around just one record, this is what's called call data records, and looking at, for example, that kind of thing in a conflict situation. There's some really interesting stuff that you can do around the archival and analysis of just one platform. And it might not be applicable the world over in the same way, and certainly might not be applicable in Patani or Thailand writ large, but I'm just suggesting to you ways in which you can look at it. And I'm talking about Twitter here. I have archived in Sri Lanka every single Twitter interview of every single politician and government official or public official around the country or on the country in the past 2 to 3 years. And I've done that because otherwise the country loses a record of what was discussed, but also importantly for me, the silences. What wasn't answered? What wasn't picked up? And all of that content is on Twitter. And so it behoves us to archive it, to record it, to analyze it, to disaggregate it, and to see how it can help us in our work. And this is not esoteric. In the last Kenyan elections, there was an amazing process called umati. It's a Swahili word. And umati tried to, or did very successfully, look at hate and dangerous speech exchanged over SMS, over, I think, 7 dialects, including English and Swahili, and proactively sent peace or conflict transformatory messages to the communities that had demonstrated heightened violence in the last presidential elections a couple of years ago. So it was analyzing that which was on SMS and messages and proactively trying to reduce the friction between communities. And I think that that kind of work is fundamentally interesting, using content that you would not otherwise use for conflict transformation. Another hidden thing is actually coming from this country. Some of you may have seen this remarkable image around the country, gone viral over Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. Now, what does that mean? Three-fingered salute. This three-fingered salute comes from The Hunger Games. It's a Hollywood movie. Nothing to do with Thailand. It's called The Hunger Games, a great movie, actually comes from a series of books. And this was a symbol of resistance, of course, within the fiction of the movie. There were two young characters. They come from District 13. And the fiction of the movie is that this becomes a symbol of hope. This becomes a symbol of resistance and of challenging the dominant power structure. And you see that after the changes in Thailand, that hundreds of people were photographing themselves doing this, and it went viral. Now, if you didn't understand what was going on, you didn't understand that this was resistance. This is not a column in the newspapers. This was not an academic paper. This was not a political party speech. This was not a rally. This was not a protest. Simple gestures denoting resistance. There's also something that's coming out of the US, and it's this. It's this, and it's coming from Ferguson. And it's called Hands Up, because the black individual in Ferguson had his hands up when the policeman allegedly shot him 6 times. And so this is going viral in the US. It's called Hands Up. And if you go and see some of this, you see that there is a resistance, there's an opposition, there's a concern about the policing in the US by just that message, hands up. And these are called memes, M-E-M-E-S. And that's a genuinely new phenomenon that is resident on the web, that is actually resistance, pictorially, photographically, that goes viral. The third example is from the Tiananmen Square from earlier this year, where the authorities in that country simply did not allow the commemoration of Tiananmen Square in 1989. And so there are some wonderful, wonderful ways, creative ways in which the Chinese community who wanted to remember that, remembered it, but using memes. So they used coffee, they used playing cards, they used yellow ducks. And to understand this as resistance and opposition and conversation is to understand the power of technology as well in conflict transformation. My question is, if we don't even know that these discussions are happening, how on earth, as peace practitioners, can we address certain types of conflict in certain geographical locations? And so the problem I face as a practitioner is also over the prevalence of this kind of technology. For example, when I've gone to Myanmar, it is really today a country that is not a country that's very well connected. It's probably what many of us call the last frontier of an information society. It's only now that telecoms are going into the country and people are getting connected to the degree that we take for granted. And I wonder whether, for example, them coming on board onto Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, for example, is going to enhance or decrease the conflict in that country. What is, for example, a local, regional conflict in the Rakhine with the Rohingyas, for example, is probably more internationalized today than people within their own country know about it. But in the years to come, as the narratives are exchanged in the country, in their own language between these regions, is there an inherent and innate potential for enhanced violence that's more geographically dispersed, or are we also going to take this as an opportunity to observe what has happened in other contexts and say technology is going to be an integral, intrinsic part of how we have to look at conflict transformation in that country in the years to come? So I want to end it all by looking at some of the metrics that are important or will be important for us as peace builders in the future, whether we are journalists or practitioners on the field. And for example, these are metrics that you would not otherwise have thought about. I don't think that Uppsala and other leading organizations dealing with peace building have thought about these metrics. And I encourage them, and my submission humbly is that they do. And as academics, we do. Phone penetration, call data records, social media adaptation and adaptation, disaggregated by platform. Web search metrics, it might not be Google, it might be other search engines that are more popular in a particular region because it's in their own language. Smartphone sales, based on which demographic. The cost of broadband access and the accessibility of broadband. The 3G or 4G mobile phone penetration. The tablet sales, the iPad or the Android tablet sales. The use of WhatsApp or IM apps, instant messaging apps. These, I find, are very interesting markers of conversations that have a bearing on particularly conflict zones. For example, in June, mid-June, there was the worst example of communal violence in Sri Lanka post-war against the Muslims in a particular southern city in Sri Lanka called Alutgama. The worst communal riots that we have seen in years, also because my country is facing the horrible phenomenon of Islamophobia over the past 2 years alone, which is a different story. But what's really interesting for me is that over the period of time in which that violence was possibly exclusively reported over social media, because there was a complete media blanket censorship in the mainstream media in the 3 or 4 days after the violence, there was a 30% increase over Google searches on Sri Lanka, which is statistically there. So it's very interesting that what is talked about in social media can contribute to greater awareness around that particular event or process or incident simply because that content is now being produced, even though it might not be actually reflected in the mainstream media. And my submission is that the information society, it's a term from the United Nations, the information society today and the econometrics around that are indivisible from our political society. The two have merged. And if the political society, a just society, a harmonious, equitable, equal society is a marker of peace and conflict, then we really need to think about what drives, what forms, what shapes, what contests there are in the information society around technology. And that brings me to who is not here in the room today. There is an august, there are wonderful students. It's so lovely to see all of you here. There's the faculty. There are my colleagues who come from abroad. There might be other experts from the region as well. So it's really, really a wonderful opportunity. But there are also people who are not here, and I think who need to be here if you're talking about peace moving forward. I think we need marketers. Marketers have a phenomenal understanding of audiences. And if we seek to address them proactively, I think we need to look at how they address and also learn some of the tactics from them, particularly with regards to technology's use. I think we need telecoms companies. I think we need so-called telcos. They are the arbiters of information in our countries today. If, like in Sri Lanka, the Ministry of Defense tells to an ISP, thou shalt not allow access to a website, they become controllers of the information we consume. And telcos are fundamentally important if so much of what we are producing, disseminating, and talking about is using their infrastructure, and we are dependent on them. We need advertisers. We need to know how to make our message stick, particularly in the short attention span that so many of us have on social media. As peace practitioners, and with the deepest respect to my former speaker, I'm going to use him as a lab rat in this example. The kind of statistics and graphs and 40-page research papers, much though they may be interesting to academics, simply don't have traction with the very people who are now in charge of these conflicts and their transformation, a younger demographic who are used to a more telegenic means of engaging with those conversations over social media. We don't always have the tools to address this community. They are impatient with us. They are impatient with long reports. They want capsule information. How do we get that across? I think we need tech companies. We tend to reinvent the wheel. Every time we say we come to a conference, I say, let's have a research network. I always find the idea, let's create a new research network. Let's create a new platform. Let's create an Asian platform. Why the hell do we need an Asian platform? All the Asians I know of are on Facebook. All the Asians I know of use All the Asians I know of use Twitter. They use it differently, but we use it. So let's talk about leveraging the technology already out there, which I think is why we need to also embrace the tech community. They are important voices. They have the platforms, they have the reach, they have the money, they have the scope. They might not have the interest, and it's up to us to encourage them to come on board some of these discussions as well. And I think without these people in the room, not all of them all the time, but at least some of them most of the time, we are losing out on the potential of peace building as we move forward. To end, I want to talk about the title of my presentation, Scylla and Charybdis. I said it was misuse and ignorance that plagued us as we move forward. Ignorance has an easy answer in one sense. Awareness and education can help get rid of ignorance. But I think moving forward, we need to embrace some of these technologies that our children might be using. We need to produce more. We need to engage, interact. We need to study more critically. And we also need to expand our imagination. Revolution 2.0 by Wael Ghonim in Egypt is a phenomenal book around the use of technology in that country's tryst with democracy. So it's not a technological determinism, but it's to see how technology can play a role in how we move forward. I would say two things, and this comes from the heart of what I do, and I'll end by saying that. Do not overestimate the power of government to shape our future. Today, we control it in ways that they cannot control, they cannot contain, and they cannot censor. And that is a unique moment in human history that we, I think, as peace builders, but just as citizens, need to take hold of. The second is also a word of caution. Don't underestimate the power of government and those who have power. They can still shape our future. And I think that as participants in this conference, if anything, we need to take away from here that today, that which you have in your hip pocket, in your handbag, in your pocket, or the palm of your hand, is literally the key to a more equitable, just future. And that is the submission based on my own life and my own humble work that I would like to leave and possibly inspire and certainly debate and discuss with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hattotuwa, for your insightful speech.